Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Asia House. Welcome to those in the room and the 100 plus who are already online watching us. Today's discussion, carbon markets and the drive to net zero in Asia, which we are producing in partnership with Standard Chartered. Today we'll explore the progress in the development of carbon markets, their importance in achieving climate goals, particularly the role they can play in Asia. Asia currently accounts for more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions, with coal the biggest source of energy generation. As Asia's economies continue to expand, and in some cases quite rapidly we expect, and along with that their energy demands, the region has become the focal point of climate change mitigation efforts. Carbon markets are increasingly seen as a core component to the drive to achieve net zero. Carbon offsets allow countries or companies to pay others to cut greenhouse gas emissions to offset their own. While companies are already trading carbon offsets in private markets, there's still no agreement on international rules to govern carbon trading. At COP26 in Glasgow, an agreement was reached on the broad principles governing international carbon markets, which was seen as a breakthrough at the time, but after 6 years or something of deadlock. However, at COP27 and subsequently, there's been no agreement on the important technical details. There are a myriad of stumbling blocks there still. In the absence of a global market, national and regional schemes are coming on stream. And these are the subject of considerable scrutiny and at times criticism. China officially launched its national emissions trading scheme in 2021, and it's seen as an essential part of China's strategy to achieve its climate goals. The EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, is due to start October 1, initially in a simplified form, and it's going to be phased in gradually over something like 9 years. But CBAM has triggered fierce debate, particularly around trade policy. Critics say that CBAM is likely to disproportionately impact Asia's export economies, shifting more of the economic cost of addressing climate change to developing countries. We have among our distinguished guests today the EU's recently appointed Director General at Climate Action. So we'll be asking him about CBAM and the impact on Asia in that discussion. In a few moments, I'm going to invite our distinguished speakers to join me on stage and virtually. And just to be clear, we welcome your involvement in this session. Whether you're in the room or online, we'll be bringing you in for questions and comments. Please feel free to engage. We're really keen to have you involved. But first, just to set the framework for our discussion, Zuchen Mao, the Asia House Head of Research and Advisory, will deliver a brief presentation setting out some of the key issues in carbon markets and the drive for net zero. Zuchen.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to provide a high-level view on the development of the carbon markets, speaking about the key arguments in favor and against the development, the broad challenges, and Asia's economy's progress in their respective development of carbon markets. So the aim here, as Michael mentioned, is to help frame the subsequent discussion on this topic and some of the key issues. So carbon markets are increasingly seen as a core policy to facilitate the global low carbon transition. By putting a price on pollution, carbon pricing is deemed effective due to its ability to first mobilize private capital, second to reduce the cost of decarbonizing the global economy through the reduction of green premium, and third to enable cost-efficient capital allocation, and finally to generate additional revenue streams that go beyond public funds. Given the current trajectory, carbon pricing commitments are being aligned with both corporate and national goals to reduce emissions. At the moment, almost 1/5 of the global emissions are covered by carbon pricing mechanisms, equivalent to around $270 billion. And this comes in two main forms. One is the mandatory schemes, also referred to as the emission trading system, and two, the voluntary markets, also known as carbon credit schemes. The former has often been adapted by governments, various governments at different levels. Here I want to quickly highlight the binary debate around carbon market, which in a way underscores its contentiousness. Broadly speaking, despite its impact on generating financial incentives, there are several concerns and issues such as climate injustice, adverse impact of higher carbon prices, and trade implications are fueling some of its criticisms. On the advantages of carbon markets, the biggest benefit and one that is commonly discussed is that putting a price on carbon will incentivize the usage, deployment, and scaling of green technologies, making them comparatively cheaper. And this is done through the narrowing of green premiums, defined as the additional cost of selecting green technology. If carbon prices are high enough, meaning the cost of fossil fuels and the emission will also be higher, which in turn makes carbon-free options more appealing. On innovation, so if we look at innovation through a virtuous circle with innovation at the top, where innovation helps to stimulate developments of new technologies that are essential to lower the green premiums. And when green premium is lowered, this in turn will drive the adaptation of supported policies, the additional innovations, and as well as technological advancements. So it is through this virtual circle that we could reduce and eventually eliminate green premiums that will place green technologies at a much cheaper and more competitive position. With regards to some of the criticisms, there are several concerns related to the development of carbon market, and the biggest of which is the question of how do we price in the real cost of emissions, which can be costly, and it certainly can most likely trigger resentment as well as opposition. So for instance, the development of certain carbon pricing mechanisms have led to oppositions from many of the developing countries in Asia, largely because of its impact on exports, which have made it much more less competitive. And this has undermined many of the countries' export-led growth model. On the third point, given the recognition, while there's a recognition that carbon prices needs to be high enough and the scope of the carbon market needs to be wide enough to make a difference, but too often carbon prices are too cheap due to political and economic reasons. So politically higher prices could push up consumer prices that in turn could anger population groups that are adversely impacted. And economically, when expanding the scope to cover carbon-intensive sectors, it will likely to place these sectors at a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis exporters from countries with lower carbon prices. Higher carbon prices will also perpetuate the so-called carbon leakage, where firms will relocate to areas where there's looser standards, making the scheme less effective. And the last challenge is weaker intellectual and patent rights in Global South that have become a barrier to the distribution of innovative green technologies. Here I have identified several key challenges, both at domestic and international levels, and there are two factors that kind of straddle both. So at the domestic level, so how carbon policy is implemented and how firms comply with regulations are the two biggest challenges. The implementation process is complex, and technical, institutional, economic, political factors could all restrict the opportunities to implement the mechanism domestically. So with regards to the Ukraine conflict, which is quite closely linked to the second point, domestic priorities, given that many countries in Asia have placed energy security at the forefront, although higher energy prices resulting from the conflict should speed up the green push across the region in the medium term, but in the short term, coal demand is increasing to ensure energy security, given that many of the Asian economies are energy importers. So shifting domestic priorities will likely to also slow domestic green development in general. Another factor that impact both the development of domestic and international carbon market is MRV, monitor, reporting, and verification, which requires a functional digital infrastructure to ensure carbon reductions are accurately accounted for and tracked. Now, moving on to the international level. So how do we establish a global market given the differences amongst national markets, carbon markets? So, for example, the EU and China's ETS both cap and trade systems, but they diverge considerably in terms of the sectors that they cover and in terms of the carbon prices. And the second key challenge, we say, is the standardization of rules. So how do we standardize rules at the international level? Can we find this common ground on the norms and the rules to govern the international carbon market, given the varying interests? And lastly, I just want to quickly summarize the different stages of development in some of the Asia's economies. So in China, the carbon market focuses on reducing the intensity of emission rather than the absolute emissions. So currently, the ETS only includes the power generation sector, and as decision to expand the scope of the carbon market has been postponed. In Singapore, the country adopted the first voluntary scheme that allows high-quality international credit to be used to offset emissions from corporations. And in South Korea, it established the first ETS in East Asia, covering about 69 sectors in total, with ongoing reforms to better align the market with the newly updated national determinant contributions. On the right-hand side, we have several countries. We have identified several countries that is currently in the process of developing a carbon pricing mechanism. So in Indonesia, the implementation of carbon pricing mechanism was postponed largely due to the higher commodity prices. In India, the two issues we have identified are compliance and effective pricing mechanisms, despite major steps towards establishing a carbon market. In Thailand, the country launched the first carbon credit exchange in September last year to encourage enterprises to reduce emissions. And this is very much demonstrative of the growing importance of the so-called voluntary markets. And finally, in Vietnam, there's a strong political support, a political will in support of establishing the domestic pricing mechanism that will address multiple domestic objectives. So I will stop here and give the floor back to you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So that sort of sets the framework for some of the issues we'll be discussing today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first panel. Joining us virtually is Professor Wang Yao, who's Director General of the International Institute of Green Finance. Kurt Vandenberg, Director General of Climate Action for the European Union. He's joining us from Brussels. And on stage, Alicia Eastman, Co-founder and President, Intercontinental Energy, and Bill Winters, Group CEO of Standard Chartered. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today. Bill, if I may start with you, we've just heard there's ongoing debate about carbon markets. There's a myriad of different schemes happening in the world. There's no global standards. There seems to be political will in some cases, certainly an interest and support from the private sector, but a whole hodgepodge of things happening now. Just a broad question. How important is it to get carbon markets right in the race to zero?
I think it's very important, but it's like, how could we solve this problem quickly? If governments imposed carbon tax with border adjustment mechanisms and that was applied universally and consistently. Now, I wouldn't bet the planet on that happening anytime soon. In fact, I wouldn't bet the value of one of your lovely pain au chocolat on that, because there's no political will to impose that kind of cost, which leaves the carbon market highly fragmented, but also divided broadly between the public sector initiatives, or compliance markets, as they're known. The European ETS is the most effective by far, but obviously many coming up behind that, not least China. But as you say, there's no standards, no consistent standards. And then there's the private sector initiatives. We're trying very hard through an organization called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets to determine and then implement a consistent set of standards on what is a good carbon credit, what's high quality. And I thought you could have dwelled even more in your comments on how much the carbon market has been criticized for projects that aren't actually reducing carbon in the environment. So that's probably the most frequent complaint I hear is, yeah, a nice idea, but there's lots of trash that's being generated. People are paying money for credits that don't actually reduce the carbon in the environment. It's not because you can't do good projects, it's because there isn't a clear set of standards between what's a good project and what's not a good project. The Integrity Council has been tasked, following a large task force that I had the privilege of chairing for a year and a half, with coming up with those standards. And they've actually now published the initial phase of those standards, with the final implementation phase coming in the third quarter of this year. That should be a bit of a game changer in terms of setting a common standard across the voluntary private sector markets. Maybe that feeds back into the public sector over time.
Yeah. And just staying with that, and we'll explore them more later. Two key issues seems to be standards, agreeing standards, and the political will to introduce carbon schemes at a public level. Is that sort of a fair summary of where we stand now?
Yeah, thankfully we don't need political will to introduce standards into the voluntary market.
Yes.
And that's where corporations, for their own reasons, and we could expand on what those are,
yes,
are taking the initiative themselves to do the right thing.
Yeah. Professor Wang, thanks for joining us. What's been the progress so far of China's emissions trading system? It came online a couple of years ago, and how significant a role is that going to play in reaching China's dual carbon goals?
Okay, thanks for the invitation. So in China, the goal of carbon peaking and carbon neutrality has given a lot of momentum to the Chinese low carbon transition, and it very quickly transmitted into other sectoral plans, including the energy sector, financial sector, and even on the company level. Now almost all the major enterprises and banks have their carbon neutrality plans. So for the carbon market, it's a very important carbon trading is very important instrument to reduce carbon emissions. So as for China's carbon market right now, just the keynote speakers introduced only power generation companies participate in the market, but they already make China ETS the biggest carbon market in the world, covering 12% of global CO2 emissions. The carbon market in China has been officially operating since July 2021. And it is still in the very initial phase of exploration. So all the moment the emission reduction capacity is not used to its full potential, and some challenges need to be solved. For example, the average price per ton in 2020 was between $8 to $9. It's relatively low, but also we will considering about the cost of the reducing emissions of the power generation. And the trading volume was also low. The average monthly trading volume was about 1.9 million tons, indicating that carbon intensity benchmarks are too generous. So, and so now the market is also lack of the liquidity. So I think there are also a lot of things need to be improved, and we need more other sectors moving to this market.
Okay. Kurt Vandenberg, thanks for joining us, and also congratulations. You've been in your role 2 weeks now. I want to talk to you about CBAM and some of the criticism of CBAM, especially in terms of how it might affect exporting countries out of Asia. Is that on your agenda, and are you looking to see how you can work with Asian economies, developing Asian economies, to ensure that they are not adversely impacted by CBAM as it comes on stream?
Yes, good morning. Very much so. We are very much looking forward to enhance our cooperation with Asian countries and other countries around the world on carbon pricing and on explaining what the CBAM is about. Let me first say that we, as keynote speakers have said, we can show in Europe that carbon pricing works. We now have it in place since 2005. It took a bit of time to really take off and be effective, but since 2005, we have reduced carbon emissions by 35% in the sectors covered, industry and power generation, which cover 40% of emissions in Europe. And that has raised 100 billion euros, and the revenues from this are reinvested in innovation and in social justice, which is very important for us as well. It works so well, actually, that there is now been a political agreement, not only to firm up the ambition of carbon pricing through the European trading system, but also to extend it to new sectors like buildings and road transport. Now, as we are firming up the ambition of the ETS, we of course also run a larger risk of carbon leakage, whereby companies would relocate their activities to other parts of the world where there would be no carbon pricing. Until now, we have dealt with this risk of carbon leakage by giving free allowances to the sectors and the companies that would be at risk of carbon leakage. But that had the disadvantage that it did not give an incentive or a push for these companies to really invest as they should in carbon emission reduction. So that's why we have introduced the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is now politically agreed since December last year. The idea is that we put an equal price on imported as on domestically produced goods. We start with a limited number of sectors like cement, steel, hydrogen has been added. And we really have designed it as a purely climate policy tool. So it is really to prevent carbon leakage, and it contributes to environmental and climate objectives only. It's been designed in a way that it is entirely WTO compliant because there is no discrimination between imports or domestically produced goods, and there is no double protection because as we will gradually introduce the CBAM over 9 years, as the keynote speaker, the earlier keynote speaker said, we will also phase out the free allowances. So that makes it even more WTO compliant. What we would like to see is that we use CBAM and we talk with our trading partners on CBAM so that it becomes an incentive for countries to ramp up their clean production and strengthen their climate policy. If they do so, that will result in a lower CBAM levy that the importers would have to pay at the border. That's actually what we see in a country like Thailand, for example, which is looking at carbon pricing because they say, rightly so, it's better that we pay for carbon at home rather than pay to the European Union. And actually for us, the most ideal carbon border adjustment mechanism would be one that doesn't generate any revenues at all, because all countries that trade with Europe would have introduced a carbon pricing system, as was also said by Bill earlier. Now, there are many implementation questions. That's why we will take it very gradually. We will start in October this year until 2026 with a dry run. So we will test the system without any payment requirements. And then we will gradually, over 9 years, introduce the CBAM in the same way as we will phase out the free allowances for all companies. That will give ample time to talk, cooperate, discuss with companies and with countries on how best to do this in a way that it contributes to global climate global carbon reduction goals.
Yeah, so no, I understand the 10-year time frame obviously gives you space to negotiate and iron out some of the kinks. But Alicia, you look at this through a different lens because you're producing green hydrogen. Your aim is to do it at scale. You're involved in a number of projects. But From your perspective, what role carbon markets play in driving that business?
So you're right, we have 4 projects, 2 in Western Australia, 1 in Oman and 1 in Saudi. The smallest project is 25 gigawatts of upstream wind and solar. Then we produce green hydrogen, then green ammonia, mostly targeting shipping. So green ammonia to be used as a marine fuel. So for us, obviously, having a price on carbon makes our product more competitive because you're comparing it and it's easier to buy a green product if it costs the same as a dirty product. I do think that there is political will involved always, even if it's just, if you call it the private sector and you call it the public sector, even within the private sector, there is political will required to get the private sector to move towards this. And part of it is the vocabulary. And I noticed that when we talk about carbon pricing, I think that's the right way to think about it. It is the price of the externality produced by this manufacturing or whatever is being created. But when we talk about the green premium, that is a blame on a green product, which the product should be green. And I feel that this use of the green premium is really counterproductive to political will. You know, when GE got caught dumping chemicals and setting the Ohio River on fire, they didn't say, well, I don't want to pay that green premium of, you know, disposing of my chemicals in the correct way, right? No one would agree with this because you're not allowed to do that. And that is how we need to treat all of the sectors. It's not just power, it's every sector, and it's all your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, because there are going to be alternatives like us. And that means that you will be able to reduce your carbon and pay less in taxes or CBAMs or whatever. But because it's going to take a while, it's going to take a while even for us to be producing. We definitely require carbon credit system. I think it's fantastic, and they're self-supportive.
So if not green premium,
Yeah.
address it.
Well, he calls it a carbon tax. I mean, I think it's, I think that's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
You're paying for carbon to offset,
Yeah.
right? So I think that describes it well. But when you talk about a green premium, then that is actually putting the blame on the green product, right? Whereas the green product should be the default. The product that is not priced in the negative externalities and is just selling for whatever it is, it's not taking into account the health effects on people in the area or all of the different negative externalities, that we're calling normal. And then we're calling the green product one with the green premium. And the green product should be normal.
So, Bill, Zhu Chen went through some of the states, some of the national developments in Asia. Standard Chartered is involved in Climate Impact X, which is based in Singapore, and you're one of the founding partners in that. Is it the sort of model that you see being exported to other countries in the region? Is this the next step in development of national carbon markets?
It could be. I mean, I think our thought at the outset with Climate Impact X was that there's very little transparency in the voluntary carbon market today. And of course, there's transparency in the national compliance markets, but as you pointed out, it's very fragmented and the standards are quite different. And it's inaccessible actually to many investors. It's just very, very local in many cases. Europe obviously is taking the lead and opening that up, has taken the lead. But Climate Impact X was a simple recognition that a lot of the ways to protect carbon going into the environment, so in this case, largely nature-based solutions, so protecting existing nature or restoring nature in a way that protects the existing carbon sinks. Like, the biggest single thing that we could do today to improve the outlook for our carbon budget is to stop burning down tropical rainforests. That's the single biggest thing we could, and it's not that hard to do, but of course the economic incentives to slash and burn are very, very high. And it turns the stomach a bit when you say, well, we'll have to pay the farmers not to do the wrong thing. But I hate to say it, we have to pay the farmers or whoever not to do the wrong thing. And without paying them, these are people that are trying to make a living.
Absolutely, yes.
So Climate Impact X is saying, okay, we want transparency. We want to get some liquidity into the market. We want it available to everybody. We want to promote a common set of standards. They are based off of what's coming out of this Integrity Council.
Yes.
So a baseline of high confidence. You know, if you buy a carbon credit through Climate Impact X, you're getting something that's been validated and is good.
Yeah.
Good is still somewhat controversial, I'll say.
Yes. Yeah.
But we'll say that it's good. And then we can move from there, because it's not just protecting existing nature or planting new forests. It's also, I'm not going to say green premium. I think your point is really good, Alicia.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it costs more to produce hydrogen than it does to burn bunker fuel in the ship. And to the extent that we can use the carbon credit market to help get the scale necessary to bring that cost down, you eliminate one of those big impediments to taking up these clearly end state projects.
Professor Wang, China's ETS, do you see that as influencing China's neighbors in the region? Do you see that as accelerating carbon market development elsewhere in Asia?
Yes, sure. Actually, China have some experience. We have a national ETS, and also from 2013, we already have 8 local, that's regional carbon ETS. And this different ETS, they have actually some different mechanisms. And for the national ETS now, we only have for the controlled entities, they can join. Now we only have a power generation, and so that they have some problems, lack of liquidity, and also when we want to do some carbon pricing schemes and to do carbon finance, we also face the problem that the carbon market, that the spot markets, they already have problems, and we do not have a future market. But for the for some regional markets, just like I just have a survey from Hubei province. It is one of the biggest regional market, and they encourage more investors into this market, and so they make these markets more how to say, more they have more liquidity in this market, but also they face problem is that the scale is very limited. So we think we should to make this national market and also regional markets to be one big market. But we have a lot of problems that including policy, the high level design, and they have one debate, that is the carbon market. Is the carbon market have finance characteristics? I think this is in China, some people think that carbon market is only carbon markets, is just to have the function that to reduce emissions. But there are some other people think that we should make these carbon markets to have a capitalization that make other investors into this market, to make these carbon pricing mechanisms more better for the emitters to reduce their emissions. So they have still, have many challenges and also experience. I think China's carbon market can be a good market to be Asia's, to make other countries can learn from China's experience and also lessons.
Kurt, I talked to Bill earlier about standards, and that's one of the key issues in the development of carbon markets, whether they be national or hopefully at some point international. Do you see the role of the EU as trying to develop global standards with CBAM as the vehicle to do so?
Yes, that's part of our agenda. And by the way, we are really happy about our cooperation with China on emission trading systems. Since many, many years, there's been a closer relationship. And I think what is happening in China is very promising. Obviously, as was pointed out, there are differences. The Chinese system is more on intensity of carbon emissions, while in Europe, it's about setting an absolute cap. But I think there's definitely a scope here for working better together on how to introduce emission system, firm it up, emission trading system, but also work on the standards. Now, it's clear that for a CBAM to work, and that was pointed out also in the presentation, you need standards on monitoring, reporting and verification. We are now preparing all the implementing regulations that we will need for this. We will reach out to our trading partners to explain what we have in mind and also take on board good ideas, good frameworks that already exist elsewhere. But for this system to work, you obviously need an agreement on these MRV rules. And we hope that the CBAM will help to have a good discussion and cooperation with our trading partners so that over time we come to a global convergence on what these standards could be or should be.
Okay, we are going to come to questions in a moment. So if you have a question in the audience, please let me know. We already have somebody who's volunteered to ask the first. Also, if you are joining us virtually, let the team know, and I'll bring you in as soon as we can. Alicia, just before we go to questions from the audience, technology has a big role, right across the sweep of carbon markets and reporting and the like. But it's an important part of the development of your products. Do you see the potential for attracting more investment in developing green hydrogen as carbon markets scale?
Yes, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly, obviously, as I said before, you compare the pricing and it looks more favorable if there is a carbon offset market where it's been priced. But also, our projects are in places with ideal resources. So they have like very high wind at night, a lot of sun during the day. So it's the cheapest energy in the world. It's green and it's cheap. And it will attract people who make steel or who make things that require a lot of energy. It will attract people to our ecosystem. And one of our projects is in Oman, which would be considered part of the global south, or at least IFC's definition. But there are a lot of countries that are in the global south that have good resources that could be producing green hydrogen, green ammonia, and of course the electrons. So I do think you might see movement of companies going to other places, but not necessarily to go somewhere where the regulations are more lax, but to go somewhere where they can get cheap green energy. And those places have now changed. It's not all in OECD countries, it's also in the global south. And that's we need to pull them in, right? And we have the same problem with shipping, because we have these green shipping corridors that we're planning, but those really are only okay between Singapore and Rotterdam, or one wealthy market and another that are willing to pay more for their product and actually pay for what pollution that they've created. And the way that we bring in the global south and get IMO to support that is by having them have a stake in it, having them either producing the same product, or if you're Thailand or Vietnam, making electrolyzers, or there's all sorts of things in the value chain that could be great economic and could be good for what we're considering the parties that are going to be hurt the most by this. That's how we have to think about it. How do we make this an opportunity instead of a penalty for those countries that watched the West pollute all over the place and create most of this problem, and now we're like, oh well, you're not allowed to grow.
That's interesting. So because there is one of the fears of carbon markets is that business will go to wherever price is cheapest, which is just the nature of a market. But you're saying the attraction should be go to where the resources enable green energy to be produced. So it's a different way of looking at it.
Well, green is cheapest now.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you go to a market that has good resource, we are the cheapest. I mean, you're not going to get 1 penny per kilowatt hour, you know, with oil.
Okay, let's go to questions now. And again, if you want to ask one in the room, we'll come to you, or lots of questions. But first, Catherine Stodolka from Systemic.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and such an incredibly important panel. But I think I really have to acknowledge, Alicia, your comments about the opportunity here, but also the redefinition of where we're going to see kind of industrial hubs in the future. And it will be countries which have the cheapest energy, and they're going to be countries with the greenest energy, and also with obviously transport and regulatory advantages. We do a lot in the green hydrogen space in Namibia, for example, and it's not a country that you mentioned, although you did mention Australia, so well done. I guess shifting from that very important point, though, I think I've been volunteered to ask Bill a question, and it's nice to see you again after we were on the stage at G20, again, maybe under duress. But really, we've talked about carbon markets, creating new, incentives for new green assets, also for nature-based solutions, which if we don't keep talking about nature when we talk about net zero, we just don't get there. So thank you for putting nature and adaptation, I think, at the core of what you're doing, particularly this year. Are you also thinking that that there's going to be demand for carbon credits around early coal closure and some of the, pay to not do rather than kind of incentivize the do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most exciting developments through the JETP process has been the inclusion of a coal decommissioning component in the Indonesia JETP. And that, I thought it was just remarkable that Secretary Kerry, who had not been a particularly strong advocate of carbon markets, I think there was a bias, I think, to public sector solutions. And that's good, because of course he works for the US government, and there should be a set of public sector solutions. But I think there's a recognition that really the only way to get there is if the public sector and the private sector are working closely together. And shortening the life of a coal-fired power plant in Indonesia by 10 or 15 years, albeit in the future, can have a very material impact on the progression to an overall net zero economy. But like everything else, somebody has to be paid to do something that is otherwise uneconomic. And there are two ways to get paid. One is for some charitable donations from governments or individuals. Well, just doesn't work, and we don't have those. Really, it will end up being tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds if this gets fully scaled. The other is to originate carbon credits by doing the right thing, selling those credits in the market, and then funding the conversion from coal-fired power plants in that particular case to renewable forms of energy. So I think it was an extremely important validation of the impact of private markets on what is a public objective, a societal objective, and that can be applied to all the good things that could happen. It could be applied to increasing the brown tax. We won't call it the green premium, but we know that there are technologies that work, but they're not economic today, all else equal. And we can have some form of government subsidy that gets us there. It probably will be too little, and it will certainly be too late. Or we can unleash the private sector, of course, with all the right incentives, and get the money into the right place quickest. And the best way to do that is with a market. Carbon credits are a good medium of exchange.
Okay, all right, question for the room. So, have you passed the microphone over here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Simon Paulson-Jones from Climate Solutions. We've talked about the compliance market. We've talked about the voluntary carbon markets. We're now starting to see a third carbon market evolve, sovereign carbon market. Or you said that the biggest thing we can do is stop chopping down the rainforests. My firm, in its capacity as a book runner for 5 rainforest nations, is talking to some of your colleagues and numerous others. I'd be interested in your perspective on the role of the sovereign carbon markets in helping us achieve net zero in Asia and indeed.
I think the sovereign carbon market is directly connected to the network of voluntary carbon markets. We'll have the same challenge. I mean, somebody has to buy those credits, and they're going to buy them if they are motivated to do the right thing. And we can have long conversations about what motivates people to do the right thing. Different motivations for different people. And two, if they're confident that by buying that credit, they're going to be recognized as having done the right thing. And right now, I can tell you, you buy a carbon credit that you think might be a good thing to do, you're probably helping a little bit, but you're more likely to move backwards in terms of the objective that you have, which is to really convince your employees, your shareholders, and your clients that you're a good company, right, in the private sector, in this greenwashing fear. So we've got to get the confidence up, and that would apply as much to sovereign-initiated credits. Very interesting to watch now is some of the countries that have been actually very good at protecting their nature, who are now thinking, I can monetize those credits. I never have. It didn't motivate me in the beginning, but I can do that now. Yeah, it's quite controversial, right? Because the question is, well, you weren't going to cut the rainforest down anyway, so why should we pay you not to do it now? The flip side is, well, how do you know we're not going to do it anyway? I mean, it's getting a bit bleak out there, and our cost of living has increased by 30%. Our cost of energy has gone up. Our people are starving. Maybe this is the time that we have to change path. If we're not allowed to join the market. So, and I guess that would be a sovereign credit that we're talking about. Do we have confidence that when we buy that credit, we're actually protecting something that was at risk? And that's why we need to have an agreed set of standards.
Okay, we'll take a question from Zoom now. Oh, tons of questions in the room. I'm afraid we're probably not going to get time to take all of them. A question from Zoom.
This is a question for Kurt Vandenberg. My name is Saul Rubens. I work for STEMCor Limited. We're a steel trading company. I've spoken to quite a few of your colleagues at the EU, Mohammed and Vicente and so forth. My question to you is, what is the EU doing to counter the objection to CBAM from countries like China and Brazil and India and South Africa?
Kurt, that's for you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer this one. Well, what we will do is discuss with these countries and explain. And as I said, we have designed the CBAM in a way that we feel and are convinced it is entirely WTO compliant because there is no discrimination. It is an incentive to our trading partners to strengthen their climate policies and possibly also introduce carbon pricing. The more they strengthen their carbon policies, the less their exporters to the EU will have to pay to the CBAM in Europe. And by the way, I should also say that the CBAM is not targeting countries, it is targeting products and companies. So we are fully confident that with the gradual introduction of the CBAM and a very good explanation and working together on how to strengthen carbon policy frameworks across the world, the CBAM will actually be not the obstacle that trading partners or some of our trading partners believe it could be, but a really good way to strengthen global climate ambition. And by the way, we have other trading partners that see CBAM as a very welcome opportunity to strengthen this global climate ambition. So there's a lot of explanation, discussion, and cooperation to be done, and we are gearing up for that.
Thank you.
One more question from the room before we wrap up, please.
Danai Kiriakopoulou from the London School of Economics, and we've been working the past year with the G7 on the Climate Club agenda and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action on the Helsinki Principles, and of course carbon pricing is on that agenda. My question is, how do you see carbon pricing as a kind of part of the wider package? Because correcting the market failure is one thing, but we need structural transformation, and especially for countries where for political economy reasons it may be difficult, at least in the short term, to go ahead with that. Are there other ways to lower the green premium, to reference Alicia's terminology, in terms of making other technologies more competitive, sectoral agreements, for example, supporting the acceleration of those technologies? How do you see carbon pricing and markets in the wider context? Thank you.
That one's to Bill, and then Alicia.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go, Bill. I wasn't sure who it was to.
I'll be very quick. I think pricing isn't a proper carbon price. Doesn't give you the right answer. It's just a tool that you use. It becomes a language that we use to implement a whole range of other programs. And when I think about corporate decision making, right now the decision to invest X in order to reduce Y amount of carbon is somewhat hypothetical, because there's actually no cost to you for producing that carbon today. And there may be some social costs, there may be some NGO pressure cost, very difficult to quantify that into an IRR decision in a business case. If there's a price for carbon, then it's very straightforward. So the price doesn't in and of itself lead you to the right place. It just allows you to speak a language that gets you to the right place more easily in all of the realms that you're talking about. That's
I mean, I completely agree. I think that it makes the right choice easier to make, essentially, because you've made the one that is harmful more difficult. So it leads people into a different direction. I mean, obviously, we have to keep an eye out for any kind of moral hazard when we're encouraging people to do anything, any type of incentive system. You have to think about the unintended consequences of that and what might happen. Like with bio oil now in Europe, people are supposed to be using waste oil from cooking, and the price has gone up so high that they're buying real, like, new oil and combining it with the waste oil and then selling it. And like that's the kind of moral hazard that happens. And it's just, you're doing all of this work to be monitoring and to be calculating. You also have to put in the work to sort of think of every awful thing someone could do with this incentive, where it would take it in the wrong direction. But yeah.
Right. Look, I'm afraid we're out of time. In fact, we've run vastly over, and I know there are lots of questions. We'll obviously have to reconvene this group again in the near future. Please thank my speakers, Professor Wang, Kurt Vandenberg, Alicia Eastman, and Bill Winters. Thank you very much indeed.